All right, welcome to a quick series on labor-based grading, which is a new grading technique that I have been using in my algorithms and other computer science classes for the last year during the pandemic, in part to combat some of the challenges that arose moving to online teaching, including an increase of academic dishonesty and an increase in student anxiety. If you're interested, hopefully that's why you're here, to learn a little bit more about labor-based grading, then please check this out. So I'm going to start with just what is labor-based grading. To start out, I'll just mention it's an alternative to our normal grading style, and I think that's sort of what I have depicted here. At least this would be very common for one of my classes. You have a number of assignments, quizzes, maybe midterms, finals. Students get numerical grades. There's some policies in the course about what percent is weighted for each chunk, and at the end of the quarter, you do some math, and you plug it into a spreadsheet maybe, and you get some number out, which at my school might translate into a B. Hopefully, if you're in a STEM class, you look at this, you say, yeah, that kind of looks like my class, maybe one or two changes, but yeah, that looks pretty normal. This is what I'm going to consider to be the standard grading model that most of us use, with some minor variation. And if you have a more major variation that you might be leaning towards labor-based grading already, I certainly was in some of my grading practices, and then after finding labor-based grading, I found that hey, why don't I switch all the way over? So what is labor-based grading? This is what my class looks like now, my algorithms class. A lot of this data is mostly taken from my algorithms class. In my class now, we have still some assignments, quizzes. I have a few extra kinds of homework, and we have missing exams. And that one reason is all of the labors in the class will be equally weighted. The only way that they're graded is complete or late or miss or incomplete. There's certain categories. You can see most of them listed here. And during the quarter, this matrix is sort of replacing the course policies. I call this the grading matrix. It tells you how many lates and miss and incompletes you're allowed to accumulate to achieve certain grades, base grades during the quarter. And at the end of the quarter, we still do a little bit of math. It's much simpler math. You just look at this table to figure out what your base grade is. And then if you have performed any extra labors, which for the moment consider these to just be extra credit homework, you might earn yourself a couple boosts, and that's how you might get past your base grade of 3.1 up to a 4.0. This example student here, for instance, solved two of them and earned a 3.7. So this is just a quick outline of what you might expect from labor-based grading. It's a different kind of grading, and we might say, well, why would we want to adopt this? And so in my experience with labor-based grading in the last I think it's been 4 quarters, so a full year. I have encountered a number of benefits. There's probably more that I forgot here. I have also definitely encountered a number of cons or drawbacks, but some of them I've found ways to mitigate. So I am a little bit biased here. I think labor-based grading is great, and so those might not be appearing up there. But I might try and dispel some of them. If you have any questions, you maybe think I missed something that you think is a drawback, reach out to me, and I will certainly try and address and maybe describe to you ways that I found that I can mitigate some of those other drawbacks. First of all, let's look at what I think are some of the benefits. So listed among the first here, you can see the diversity, the equity, and the inclusion. I really think these are important. These are things that a lot of faculty are focusing on right now in STEM and in other fields, and I too think that they're important. And you can see that the labor-based grading actually does make some important strides towards this, not just little steps, but important strides towards increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in your class. In particular, you end up getting a wider diversity of solutions, allowing your students to solve problems in ways that are maybe non-standard or different from the ways that you've presented in class. I really like to encourage my students to explore different ways to solve their problems. They're not always correct, of course, but you definitely get a lot more diversity of those solutions as a result of this. Another important thing is you get more equity. I don't really want to talk too much to that just because there's a lot that can be said about that, and I will reference that towards the book on labor-based grading by Dr. Inoue. I will put a link down below to that book, which is freely available online. And if you're really interested in doing this stuff, I encourage you to track it down and read it. Other things that you can see benefits from adopting this include creating a bigger community of learners. The students reach out to each other a little bit more. I'll speak to that in a second. There is an increased trust as a result of this that's built between the students and the instructor, which allows for deeper feedback at times, which is in both directions, which is sort of the next thing here as well, that through these techniques you can get regular detailed feedback from your students about your instructional techniques, which can help you improve them, of course. An important one that I think is important, it's not as high up there because I think DEI is pretty important, maybe more important, but it also allows the students to refocus their effort on learning the material instead of just achieving grades. So there's a lot of energy put into a modern college student's efforts into determining how do I get the best grade and what is the instructor looking for to get the 10 out of 10. I want the 10 out of 10, not the 9 out of 10. Because there are no numbers in my class at all, there are still a few confused students saying, hey, how do I get the best grade? How do I get the best grade? But usually after a few interactions, I dispel that by just saying, look, you just need to meet the bar for completion, complete it however you think is best, focus on learning the material, and that after maybe a couple weeks of that, students really realize we don't need to be chasing down those grades. We need to be focusing on the material and trying to understand it and learning it. So as a result, that improves retention of the material. So students end up leaving the course knowing the material a little bit better, remembering the material because they've reflected on it and tried to learn it better. And then on top of which, some of the extra assignments that are built into the labor-based grading, notably reflections, that's personal unit reflections or reflections where a student might reflect on their learning activities for the last week. These help the students improve their metacognitive skills, help them understand that they are learning, and learning is going to be lifetime, not just happening in college, and that they need to train their brain to be better at learning, and that's something that they can do through these reflections, but also through interacting with us, the faculty that guide them in their learning and in these reflections. And I find that a lot of students get a lot of growth out of that aspect, maybe even more than they're getting out of just gaining some more content from my courses. They're able to take that forward and help them in future courses, and then of course outside of their studies as well. A couple that I mentioned earlier on that were my motivations to getting into labor-based grading, but turned out to be some of the minor sort of benefits of it, were that I shouldn't say reducing student anxiety is a minor benefit. That's actually really an important one to me. I really I had noticed a lot of anxiety amongst my students, and how when they bring that to the exam table, for instance, that could really hinder their ability to perform properly on those exams. Changing the way I've assessed my students has really released a lot of that anxiety. Again, they might bring in some from other classes, but after they get familiar with the techniques for a couple of weeks, they realize that they can release some of that anxiety in my class. And then part of the result of releasing that anxiety is they have less sort of motivation or temptation to cheat or perform other academic misconduct kind of actions. And then on top of which, these labor-based grading in a lot of ways kind of define away cheating. The things that would have been called cheating under the other model are actually encouraged under this model, in particular speaking to other students about the homework and trying to learn the material together. Okay, so if those are all the benefits, I hope I made it sound amazing and awesome, because I really think it does achieve all of these things, and some of them not just in a minor way, but in a major step, and that hopefully you'll find that benefit in your own class. And then there are definitely some drawbacks, and the major drawbacks that I see here really come back into how much effort and time you as a faculty member might have to put into converting your class or changing your class. And I intend to make a couple videos here just to guide you and maybe saving you a little bit of that time. Of course, I can't save you all that time because some of it is time well spent. In particular in the new grading model. So as I'll mention here, just a couple. One is just time absorbing labor-based grading, learning it. I do encourage, again, read the book by Dr. Inouye. At least a couple chapters. I would highly recommend chapter 3 and 4 that really get you into how it works. But the first two chapters are also really good as well for motivation. So you're going to spend a little bit of time doing that. Luckily, it's easy to read, and I think I did it in a weekend maybe. And then you're also going to have to spend some time after you read it and you realize, hey, this is something I want to try. You're going to have to spend some time converting your courses, and that depends a little bit on how much your course is already ready for a labor-based grading kind of approach. And then there's some relearning of things that you already know how to do. So I was pretty highly optimized at making exams and grading them and making sure I had questions that were good for those exams and so on. I had to change how I thought about assessment. I don't do exams anymore. And so I'm starting to get familiar with the new model, and I'm starting to get into some grooves again, but there's definitely going to be a learning curve or time that you're going to be spent where it's going to take you more time to engage with the new model, I should say. And what I've also found is that maybe it won't be exactly more time grading after you've had time adjusting, but it's certainly more time engaged in some of the grading activities than you would have before. The way I've sort of wrote it here in this con is that you might have to allocate your grading time in different ways. In particular, I spend a great deal of time reading personally individual reflections of my students, which are about a paragraph or a one-page reflection every week. And that's time that I hadn't been spending before I adopted this model, but it is time that I have found valuable because it is part of the regular feedback that I get from my students that have actually allowed me to improve my course in many ways. And so that's a couple of the cons that I think come along with it. And you can see a lot of them are mostly just time and effort that you have to invest into changing to this model. Once you've invested that time and effort, I think this model and all the benefits it accrues is certainly better than the prior older model. All right, so here are some of the details then, at least details from my course. I imagine anyone who would adopt this might modify or change this to your own sensibilities and your own preferences. So first of all, this is what I actually have given my students this quarter. Again, I've changed this a few times over the last couple of quarters since it's new to me as well, and I might change it a little bit more in the future, but the current form is in this form with the intention of making it really quickly and easily digestible by my students so that they can read it, say, okay, I kind of understand, and then move on and get to what they really want to do, doing the work and so on. So here's the overview. Just to start out, first of all, everything in the class is going to be a labor. That's what we call it. That's just terminology. So assignments, quizzes, and so on, they're called labors. They will all be graded either as complete, incomplete, or ignored. The complete ones are further sort of subdivided into on time, late, or missed. And over on the right, I have a little glossary that tells us what that means. Late, in my class at least, means within 7 days after the due date, and missed means anytime after that. And I think I've seen in other classes these values be changed to a couple days or however long you think is valuable for late. Because I have weekly deadlines, to me 7 days seems like an appropriate time to hand in something late. There's also some other definitions over there, things like incomplete or ignored. Ignored means they just haven't submitted anything at all. And I think in my classes at least, and in others who have adopted this model, ignoring work is considered to be a major strike for the student. And so usually that results in a dropping of the base grade. So those are not considered to be permitted or allowed in any way. In my course, in my algorithms course, which is a challenging math and computer science course, there are certainly units that are really hard and crunchy, as I like to call them. And so students might actually not complete the unit task, the assignment, or the quiz in that particular unit, or maybe even both. Now, they are usually allowed to resubmit, in which case they will often come back as late or missed. But if they don't and they leave it to the end of the quarter, they might end up being incomplete. And that usually means that they failed to follow the instructions in some major way. Usually that means they misunderstood them, and then often in those cases they resubmit because they just had a misunderstanding, or they've made major errors and were unable to correct those errors within the quarter allocated. And if that's the case in my course, at least in my algorithms course, like I said, which is a more trickier, tougher course, I permit 2 incompletes to achieve even the base grade of a B. Or a 3.1. So that's sort of the next point here, which just says that if you complete all of the labors in the course, you just get a 3.1. And that's just a nice, easy sort of way for students to know where they stand in the course. If they're on track for completing all of the labors, then they should be comfortable that they're going to get that 3.1. And there's not usually any surprises that come out as a result. And because all labors are weekly, by the time they get to the end of the course, there's no big final that can come out and sort of scare them and change their grade. There's usually just 1 week left of things to do, and they know that they're already going to achieve that grade. So that's part of where that anxiety drop comes from. The base grade of students, of course, I think I've already sort of mentioned this, could drop down to a 2.1, 1.1, or 0. I saw that matrix before. I'll show you one in a second again. If you do, it's usually because they've accumulated too many of these sort of flags or strikes against them. In some cases, though, of course you're permitted some number of lates, missed, and so on, which case your base grade may only drop if you accumulate too many. So there is some that we might consider to be permitted, at least in the late, missed, and incomplete categories. Then finally, I've hinted at this already, but if you want to do better than your base grade of 3.1, you need to complete extra labors. And the extra labors are just optional labors, so optional in the sense that you don't need to complete them. If you leave them ignored, for instance, that's fine. Also, if you try them, attempt them, and you fail, they end up being incomplete, then that's fine as well. In the optional labors, it's only if you end up handing them in late or missed do they count against you. And so many students like to attempt the extra labors to get those extra boosts. Many students, at least in my school, find a base grade of 3.1 to be a little bit low, and so they want to earn, that 3.4 or the 3.7. That's what you can earn. Now, I've chosen to use a 0.3 boost, following Dr. Inouye, and his argument, which I agree with, is that trying to finally differentiate between your students is not usually successful. And so having sort of fewer levels of gradation means that you're probably being more accurate in actually assigning students to those gradations. And to be honest, I think that's a good argument, and maybe even there's still too many with the 0.3 boosts, but I found this has been working pretty well for my students and for myself in the last 3 or 4 quarters with the exception that there's a small group of students that make a argument for partial boosts if they're able to sort of partially complete a labor. But most of those are pretty quiet, and they understand why I will say no when I do, and why I encourage them to just finish off their labor if they want the full boost. And that's usually what they end up doing, is completing the labor and getting the full boost. So as I mentioned, here's an example grading matrix. This one is actually for one of my project course right now. I think in my algorithms course it's slightly different. It's got a 2 here, and I think a 4 here, and maybe a 6 here, something like that. But you can see this basically says if you want to achieve a 3.1 the base grade, you're allowed to accumulate 4 lates or 4 mists. This is in a class where I have 10 weeks. Each week I have about 4 possible assignments that are required, meaning we're at about around 40 assignments. So this gives them a little bit of wiggle room. Again, in my algorithms course, they might also even be allowed a couple of incompletes if they want to achieve this. And you'll notice that the rows from A and B are the same, because to achieve an A in this model, you have to achieve what is the B and then earn a few extra labors to boost yourself up. So these rows are exactly the same. And then, of course, if you accumulate too many, maybe you get more than 4 lates, you might bump yourself down to the next row down. One thing I do in my course that I think, I follow sort of a policy or a maxim that I want to maximize my students' grades at the end of the quarter. I don't really want to punish them. So one thing I do is if maybe they have 5 lates, but let's say for the example 0 mists, I'll just overflow one of those lates into the mist category, and I let sort of the better strikes overflow into the worst strikes as long as there's room to maximize my students' grades. So that if you end up in this model, if you ended up with 8 total lates but no mists, then you would still satisfy the row B, or the conditions for B. All right, I want to sort of complete this video with just a high-level view of what you can do and what I have done to adjust my course into labor-based grading. The first thing that I've done is I reorganized the course content into weekly units. And one of the reasons for this is under labor-based grading, all of the different labors will be equally weighted. And so the way to make sure they're equally weighted is to make sure they sort of are equal sized chunks of effort that your students have to do. And that's not always going to be true for all of the labors. It's certainly not true for all of my labors. But this, by splitting them into weekly deliverables, it sort of ensures that at least what you're asking of them is something that they can complete in a week. And so this is something that I had to make a change, because my older courses were organized around usually 2-week larger projects and usually 2 or 3 exams instead of quizzes. And I like that model, I have to say. I really did kind of like that model. I still like it, but it's now just a nostalgic model for me. I do this weekly model now, and I've really got a lot of benefits out of it. The students are more engaged and they retain the material better. So I've split them into take-home assignments and quizzes. My take-home assignments are still kind of larger problem and project-based assignments. I've always really valued those especially in my classes, but I think in a lot of STEM classrooms, having problem and project-based assignments that do a more holistic assessment method is certainly advantageous, and again raises engagement among the students. So I use that to really drive most of their learning is the take-home assignments. The quizzes are intended to be a lower stakes, repeatable assessment that's really meant more for my students to do self-assessment, which is at the end of the week, at the end of the unit, they perform this quiz. They just do a quick make sure they've retained the important material. So I usually use this to aim at, the take-home assignments are sort of more holistic, but these ones are more like your traditional kind of just multiple choice or a quick fill in the blanks or matching or something simple to just make sure that they're understanding the broad and important concepts that I've covered in this unit, so that when we get to the next unit, those are fresh in their mind and they're ready to move on. So those are those two, and that's sort of the more traditional assessment models that you probably already have in your class. For instance, you might already have a weekly model, in which case you're good to go on this particular step, okay? And this is, no matter what your STEM class might be, this is, whatever problems or labs that you might be assigning to your students to get them to grapple with that material that you're presenting in that class. The next step is to add a new layer of what I might call meta labors. These labors are not usually focused on the course content in the same way that the assignments and the quizzes are. They're focused on the learning of the course content. So the first one that I kind of had to just leap into blindly. I wasn't sure if this was something that was going to be valuable, these reflections. But I read the new model presented by Dr. Inouye, and I thought that this would be something worth trying. I got my students to both log their time and their efforts spent learning. So that can be anything that they do: reading the text, watching my videos, doing the homework assignment, meeting with their fellow students, talking to me on Discord, whatever it might be that they did to engage in their learning that week, they could just log it. Now, this is intended to be very, very low stakes and low time investment. Some of my students use logging software. I just use a simple spreadsheet to just list time, date, what I'm doing, how long it took, and a couple other things like how engaged I was and where I was doing it, and so on. The purpose of the logs are so at the end of the unit, at the end of the week, the students can look back at those logs, read the logs, and say, oh yeah, I recall that. And hopefully part of that is to help them retain the material, go back and review that material. But then they are asked and invited to write a reflection, which is just a free form, open-ended narrative, if you will, about their what happened in the last week. Now, some students kind of make it a more of a what did I do last summer, or what did I do last week kind of thing, just a list, in some ways repeating the learning log. I encourage them to try and be a little bit deeper in the reflection, but how deep they are in their reflection is not, I don't grade that. The completion bar on this is just doing what I ask of you, so writing a reflection. And the other students, so some of them, like I say, maybe don't get that deep into it. I try to tell my students, you get out of this what you get, what you put into it. So the deeper reflection you honestly do, the more it's going to benefit you at the end of the quarter. And some of them really do get into it, look back on their logs. I find especially some of them in the early weeks start reflecting on their own study habits and realize, oh, like I only watch the videos late at night when I'm in bed and I'm tired. Maybe I should try watching them in the afternoon when I'm more fresher mind. And next thing you know, they've found ways to better retain their material or become more efficient in their study habits, which is the purpose of these reflections. Now, the sort of the bonus of the reflections is students will often voice their opinion on all kinds of things. I hear a lot about their personal lives, which sometimes is more than I need to know, but it is certainly helps see my students as people and human beings. And then the other thing they do is they like to reflect on the course. They like to tell me what they thought about this week's assignment or this week's quiz. And sometimes they can be pretty honest about it. These are not anonymous, but they will be pretty clear. Like, I thought the homework assignment this week was kind of confusing. And the benefit to me, because I take those to heart, is I can go out there and I can change that homework assignment for the next quarter, or I can update this week's lectures to be clear, or whatever it is that they tell me. So you end up seeing patterns in their reflections that can be very beneficial in your own course. The other thing that I asked them to do is meet with their learning groups. So this is something that's part of maybe part 4 here, is create learning groups. But I'll jump ahead there just to say that I asked my students to be part of groups of usually size 4 is what I like, but just due to numbers, sometimes there's overflow or whatnot. I have a few of size 3. And I asked them, these are kind of informal groups. They are not asked to hand in any of the homework together, at least in normal classes. I have project classes where they do, but in my algorithms class, for instance, they do the homeworks, they do the take-home assignments and the quizzes on their own, but they are allowed to and encouraged to and asked to submit minutes every week of meeting with this learning group and discussing the problems, saying what are your challenges, what are your struggles, and then I always encourage them when I'm sort of telling them about these meetings to say, look, if all out of the 4 of you have all talked about the problem and you still don't know, what the right solution is, or you don't know how to get started, then that's a great idea to reach out to me, drop by office hours. I have lots of office hours and open office hours. I usually say that's when you reach out to me, and I'll get you over the speed bump and on to the next one. And again, I read these meeting minutes every week. They're not particularly, super engaging things to read, but they are sources of some feedback. And every once in a while, maybe a group of students will be too shy maybe to reach out to me during the week and say that they had a problem with a problem, but they will tell me that in their meeting minutes, and that gives me an opportunity to say, oh, here's the help that you are sort of quietly asking for in your meeting minutes. So I have found a lot of value in the reflections in the meeting minutes. I think it really is helpful in the students' metacognition and their learning skills, and then it also helps build community among them, a bunch of sort of intangible benefits that are really helpful to my students, and then on top of which it's good feedback for me, which helps me improve my class as well. Okay, so you add the reflective and the team focused meta labors, and then we move on to, okay, the extra labors tend to vary a lot in my classes that I adopt this, because it really depends in some cases upon the material that you are presenting. But here are just some high level, guidelines for what you can think of as ideas for your extra labors. Now, the first one I put in all of my classes, and I can't overstate how valuable it is. The labor journal essay is a 3 to 4 page essay, whereas basically just think of it as a super reflection, an uber reflection, where at the end of the quarter, I ask you to reflect on everything we did this quarter and pick a theme usually of growth, some personal growth theme, and explain to me how that theme was your theme for this quarter and for this course. And students pick all kinds of different themes. Sometimes they talk about algorithms or math or computer science, but that's rare. Most of the time they're talking about their growth as students, their growth as team members, their growth as people, just compassionate individuals. And so I've seen lots of great essays. Now, the purpose of the essay is, again, same as the reflection, some reflective effort, going back and looking at the material and thinking about it and helping it sink in and stick into their brain. But the real goal here is improving their writing. Writing is something that I think STEM students get not enough education in. I certainly know I didn't get a lot of it until I was a grad student, and even still, it was just trial and error. And this is a great opportunity for trial and error. So the way I run the labor journal essay is week 4 out of 10. I have a 10-week quarter. Week 4, they have to submit an outline. Week 7, they submit a draft. I mark that draft up very vigorously, no matter what writing level they're at. I mark it up very vigorously, giving them tips and how to improve their writing, how to improve their reflection, how to improve everything. And then ask them in the final week 10, to submit a final draft. And the amount of improvement in student writing as a result of that feedback process is really, really impressive. So I encourage my students to do this a lot. And so I encourage you to include that in your course as well. I put that first because it's very important, even though I don't usually list it first in my students because they probably think it's boring, although I give them the same pitch I just gave here. The next one, I think this one is easy. If you are in a normal STEM faculty already, you might already have extra credit problems in your course. I tended to put these into my class to try and keep the brighter students in my class more engaged, while some of the other students are getting caught up on the main material, especially in challenging courses. Some of the students really eat it up and love it, and they want something even harder. And so I have a bunch of hard problems, and I offer these as extra credit. Now, usually what I do is I staple them onto my take-home assignments, so that is every week I usually have one hard problem that they can do as well. And the way I do the grade boost in my class is you have to do 4 out of usually about 10 or 11 or 12 extra credit assignments to get the 0.3 boost. And if you get I also have an additional policy in my class that if you do this twice, you can double up on this particular extra labor. Now that is really for only the really brightest students, because it's going to be really hard to get 8 extra credit assignments. They tend to be hard in my class, but a number of students like that pathway as well. Also, I think I mentioned that a few students are a little bit like, can I get partial credit if I only do 2? Usually this is the one that they complain a little bit about, and I usually will say, hey, you've got 2 done already and you did a partial on another. Let's work hard on the last week or 2 to get another 2 knocked out. And again, many of them do that and achieve the boost that they were aiming at. Again, more traditional sort of extra credit is sort of a research project. I'm in computer science, so I research and or development. I could imagine in other STEM that might be research or an experiment or something like that. But whatever it might be, this is sort of a traditional write a report, pick a topic that we didn't have time to cover or one that we did and go deeper and write a research paper. And usually in my classes, I have a sort of boilerplate. You need 3 to 4 pages and do something this, but a lot of my students just find something really cool and end up writing 5, 6, or 7 pages of something really cool. And a lot of my students, I encourage them also to do experiments. So if they're going to write a program, then run some tests on it, give me a graph, do something kind of scientific with it. And so that's how I can kind of encourage that as well. In my classes, and some of my classes, not all of them, I include team projects, so students can work together on some of those. Usually I want them to work in smaller groups than larger groups if it's just a research project, but if some of them are doing development projects, they can work as a team to develop something really cool. One of my classes, which is already a project-based class, in that class students make large team projects together. And in that class I have even a larger class project that is optional, that if they want to, they can contribute to this really large project, which is really fun, and then they can get their name sort of stuck on it, which is sort of nice, and get some credit, of course. And so students like to do that. I think that's a fun one as well. Probably not applicable in all classes. And then another one, this is one that I more keep open-ended for my students, and I don't usually pitch it as an interdisciplinary project. Instead, I usually just have an extra projects thing where it just says, hey, any ideas you have that you think are cool, you can pitch them to me. And some students come in with expertise in art and fine arts or something like that, and they say, hey, this really connects to something I'm doing in art. And I say, hey, I've never thought of anything like that. Go ahead and do it. In particular, in one of my project classes, where art, the overlap with art is a little bit higher, I invite students, if they have an artistic background, to do some kind of interdisciplinary project. So those are just some options for extra labors. I feel like this is the part of the course when adapting it, I need to put the most thought in. Converting my course to weekly structure and adding some meta labors is pretty easy once you know what you're doing. Here's where I have to think, especially if I don't already have some pre-existing extra credit assignments, what can I allow my students to do? But luckily, this sort of template here, I can usually say, okay, well, design some extra credits, or now, what would research and development look like in this class as opposed to my last class, and just change that up. The last thing I want to highlight for adapting your STEM course is some of the course policies that are maybe not obvious from what I've already said, maybe implicit but not obvious, that I think are really important. The first one is learning groups. I did mention that pretty clearly. So at the beginning of the quarter, once I'm pretty comfortable with the students' registration, I assign them all to learning groups of size 3 or 4. I do random. Because the first couple of quarters I did this, I asked my students, would you rather random or not? And mostly they all said random. And the random ones tend to work out really well, or have so far. So random learning groups. Next thing you might want to do, probably pretty implicit from what I said already, is what your late and missed policies are. The only thing I would really say is if you're going to follow the same labor-based grading sort of startup that I've got here, where you're going to have late and missed, you might just do away with missed. Some faculty might think that that's fine. Then you might want to decide how long those periods are for late and missed. And that's really the only thing that I think is important there. This one wasn't really clear before, but I think I will say a little bit more about this. Is part of the philosophy, I think, behind the labor-based grading is really trying to encourage the students to learn the material no matter what, and no matter how it occurs to them. And I think part of that philosophy is allowing them to fail effectively and try again. And so I have pretty much an open policy in all my courses that if they submit anything that ends up being graded incomplete, remember incomplete could be because they made major errors, then they're allowed to resubmit it, hopefully after talking to me or their fellow learning group mates, realizing what their errors were, overcoming them, and correcting them. And if they do, those incomplete works typically get upgraded to late, assuming they just resubmit them the next week, which is the most common. Or if they resubmit them later in the quarter, often it's maybe at the end of the quarter when they realize they have a couple incompletes that they need to take care of. They might submit them and they get upgraded to mists, and those upgrades usually keep them from falling down a grade point. So that's something that I think is very important, and students, of course, very value the ability to review and resubmit their work. And then the final one is make sure you know what a good grading matrix looks like for your class. Now, Dr. Inouye suggests that this should be something that is up for discussion and debate in your class, and that early on in the quarter you should have a couple classes where you talk about it and say, what numbers do you think we should be there, and listen to arguments. I think that works a lot better in the types of classes Dr. Inouye is in. He's in writing classrooms typically, where students maybe are invited to talk and debate and join in more often. My students, while I do invite them to answer questions a lot, tend to be a little bit quieter. And in the first couple times that I invited them, hey, tell me what you think about this, I got mostly silence. So the way I pitch it to my students these days is I usually just say, okay, these things are not set in stone. And they have been settled here as a result of some discussions had with previous students. But if you have any thoughts on the matter that you want to share with me, go ahead. And I usually create a labor-based grading chat room in my Discord server for communication, where they can ask any questions they want. And I get a couple in there, but they're usually at the end of the quarter just clarifying, is this really how things work? At least that's how they are now. So that's most of what I wanted to do for this introduction of what is labor-based grading. I think I'm going to probably put a few more extra informative videos if you're really interested in how I do some of these things, show you a little bit more around. But that's it for labor-based grading. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you in that next video.